one of our associates join us for the webinar and to sort of deliver the presentation. Subhash has just turned on the fact that the PowerPoint and the event here today is being recorded, and that's just for purposes of those that aren't able to attend, and we can provide everybody a link and a copy of the event as well today. So it'll just help you for purposes of circulating and sharing the presentation. So today I'll let Mandy sort of introduce yourself, but I will say that I've had the pleasure of working with Mandy the last few years, and it's been always a great pleasure. And she's quite an expert on Indigenous HR matters, and it's really nice that she's able to give the presentation today. She'll tell you more, but she's calling in from Texas, and that's part of her work that she's doing in her education for her graduate degree. But she hails from the Red Rock Indian Band up north of Thunder Bay. And it's just a pleasure to welcome everyone and to let you tune in on this. And we're going to have some questions at the very end, so perhaps hold your questions until Mandy's able to deliver the presentation, and we'll go on from there. So Mandy, if you could sort of introduce yourself a little bit more, and we'll get things underway, and looking forward to the presentation.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour. I am Mandy Price, Indigenous. My name is Mandy Price. My spirit name is Junu Ekwe. That means Golden Eagle Woman in Cree. I am Anishinaabe Ekwe. I do belong to the Red Rock Indian Band, as Craig mentioned. I am Ojibwe on my mother's side, Cree on my father's side. I am a first-generation day school and residential school survivor. That being said, I also possess an MBA from Western Governors University, and I am currently working on my PhD in business management and leadership. So with that, ordinarily, I would be speaking to you from my traditional territory, which is the Red Rock Indian Band, who are signatories of the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850. However, I am on the Texas-Oklahoma border currently, so I am speaking to you from the traditional homeland of the Choctaw Nation found here in the US. I would also like to acknowledge that Canada as the land of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, and I recognize this land that is shared through historic treaties, developed through contemporary treaties, and land that continues to be unceded territory today. About Indigenous works, we came out of a recommendation in the 1996 report on the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. Our mandate is to increase Indigenous engagement in the Canadian economy. We are an award-winning ISO certified national Indigenous organization with expertise in workplace, employment, corporate Indigenous engagement, and partnership systems. In 2015, we launched the Kachita charity, whose mandate is to increase the human resource and career potential of Indigenous youth, including youth with disabilities, as well as our Luminary project with the intent to advance Indigenous innovation. Today's webinar objectives: we're going to overview the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the principles of reconciliation that the TRC Commission developed, as well as steps and processes to develop your own reconciliation action plan for your organizations. In order to do so, we must understand the current Indigenous population. Currently, 1.6 million, or 4.9% of the Canadian population, is Indigenous. We have 42% growth over 10 years. There's a very large younger population amongst the Indigenous groups, with strong growth in the Métis, as well as 3/4 of First Nations individuals are considered status, and 44% are on reserve. So in a nutshell, we have a rapidly growing population. Our education levels are increasing. We are growing at 4 times the non-Indigenous populations. and our populations are spread out amongst the provinces. What does that look like in 2041? So as of 2016, as mentioned, we had 1.6 to 1.8 million people. And by 2041, the total Indigenous population would include 1.5 million to 1.8 million First Nations people, 0.9 million to 1.2 million Métis, and 92,000 to 101,000 Inuit individuals. And this slide here shows what the population density would be like spread across the provinces in Canada. So we mentioned the TRC Commission. The TRC Commission came out as a result of the residential schools. What was Canada's vision? To kill the Indian within the child. Residential schools were an intentional effort by the government to assimilate Indigenous children who were forcibly removed from their homes and sent to live at these schools. These children were punished for expressing one's Indigenous culture or language, malnourishment, sexual and physical abuse, torture, lack of medical care, and neglect were common practice at these schools. It was the brainchild of Duncan Campbell Scott, who was the head of the Department of Indian Affairs from 1913 to 1939. There were 130 residential schools with approximately 150,000 Indigenous children attending these schools. These were the only schools with graveyards, and many had barbed wire fences. Communities were left without children. Social, family dynamics were destroyed and forever changed. Something to consider: every single one of your Indigenous friends are either a residential school survivor, a survivor's child, or a survivor's grandchild, or all three. Every single one. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission serves two purposes: to inform the Canadians about residential schools and their impact, and to guide Canadians through a process of reconciliation. It was established to oversee a process to provide former students and anyone affected by the residential school legacy with an opportunity to share their individual experiences in a safe and culturally appropriate manner. The work of the TRC, including videos and reports, is now housed at the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. In order to support the reconciliation process, the TRC created the Principles of Reconciliation, which we will look at further, and 94 specific calls to action. Reconciliation framework has four groupings: reconciliation through knowing and honoring, reconciliation through good process, reconciliation through action, and reconciliation through a healing relationship. The TRC also formulated 10 principles of reconciliation and believes that in order for Canada to flourish in the 21st century, reconciliation between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canada must be based on the following 10 principles. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, commonly known as UNDRIP, is the framework for reconciliation at all levels and across all sectors of Canadian society. Number 2, First Nation, Inuit, and Métis peoples as the original peoples of this country and as self-determining peoples have treaty, constitutional, and human rights that must be recognized and respected. Number 3, reconciliation is a process of healing of relationships that requires public truth sharing, apology, and commemoration that acknowledges and redresses past harm. So an example of knowing and honoring and healing relationships would be when Prime Minister Stephen Harper stood up in the House of Commons and apologized for the residential school. Number 4, reconciliation requires constructive action on addressing the ongoing legacies of colonialism that have had destructive impacts on Indigenous peoples' education, cultures and languages, health, child welfare, the administration of justice, and economic opportunities and prosperity. Number 5, reconciliation must create a more equitable and inclusive society by closing the gaps in social, health, and economic outcomes that exist between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians. Number 6, all Canadians, as treaty peoples, share responsibility for establishing and maintaining mutually respectful relationships. Number 7, the perspectives and understandings of Indigenous elders and traditional knowledge keepers of the ethics, concepts, and practices of reconciliation are vital to long-term reconciliation. Number 8, supporting Indigenous peoples' cultural revitalization and integrating Indigenous knowledge systems, oral histories, laws, protocols, and connections to the land into the reconciliation process are essential. Number 9, reconciliation requires political will, joint leadership, trust building, accountability, and transparency, as well as a substantial investment of resources. Number 10, reconciliation requires sustained public education and dialogue, including youth engagement about the history and legacy of residential schools, treaties, and Aboriginal rights, as well as the historical and contemporary contributions of Aboriginal peoples to Canadian society. Truth and Reconciliation Report. The broader theme of the TRC report is about leveling the power and privilege position. Indigenous people today are wanting to build partnerships on an equal footing. The report speaks to the need for full partnerships, mutual respect and recognition, as well as Indigenous law, legal transition, and the right of self-determination. We encourage you to read the reconciliation report and look at call to action number 92, which we are now going to focus on. Recommendation number 92 asks the corporate sector and their leadership to adopt the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, so UNDRIP. The Commission calls for meaningful consultation, long-term sustainable opportunities from economic development projects, as well as education and training for managers on the history of Indigenous people, intercultural competency or cultural capabilities, human rights, and anti-racism. They called upon the corporate sector in Canada to adopt UNDRIP as a reconciliation framework and to apply its principles, norms, and standards to corporate policy and core operational activities involving Indigenous peoples and their lands and resources. This would include, but not be limited to, asking yourself the following questions. What kind of education opportunities could be provided through online learning, instructor-led courses and/or webinars? Where are your collective knowledge gaps? How will your response help your company to improve your Indigenous inclusion workplace performance and your engagement with Indigenous communities, people, and businesses? And how will you position your company's response to the TRC report to achieve positive media and community profile? I'd like to play, this is from Senator Murray Sinclair. He was a commissioner and an influential force in developing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission 94 calls to action.
Many people have said over the years that I've been involved in the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, why can't you just get over it and move on? And my answer has always been, why can't you always remember this? Because this is about memorializing those people who have been victims of a great wrong. Why don't you tell the United States to get over 9/11? Why don't you tell this country to get over all of the veterans who died in the Second World War instead of honoring them once a year? Why don't you tell your families to stop thinking about all of your ancestors who died? Why don't you turn down and burn down all of those headstones that you put up for all of your friends and relatives over the years? It's because it's important for us to remember. We learn from it. And until people show that they have learned from this, we will never forget. And we should never forget, even once they have learned from it, because this is a part of who we are. It's not just a part of who we are as survivors and children of survivors and relatives of survivors, but as part of who we are as a nation. And this nation must never forget what it once did to its most vulnerable people.
Reconciliation. At its core, reconciliation is about relationships. The TRC explains that reconciliation means establishing and maintaining a mutually respectful relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people in this country. Reconciliation is a process of being together in a new and better way. It is about healing the past and creating a new, more honorable future. It sounds easy, but it will feel confusing, complex, and difficult to figure out. It will be a hard, evolving process, but it can also be a beautiful and liberating process. Reconciliation is not about guilt, shame, or blame. It is about acknowledging the destructive systems and harm of our collective past. It's about understanding how those destructive systems operate today and then creating new systems, new ways of relating and understanding based on respect. A reconciliation action plan, or RAPs as they are commonly called, is a strategic groundwork that enables an organization to support and advance the national reconciliation movement through deliberate commitments and leadership efforts. Each type of RAP is designed to suit an organization at different stages of their reconciliation. It allows organizations to foster and embed respect for the world's longest surviving cultures and communities, and develop opportunities within your organization or services to improve socioeconomic outcomes for all. So Reconciliation Australia developed 4 phases of the RAP, commonly known as the acronym RISE: reflect, innovate, stretch, and elevate. We're going to discuss each one of these phases in the following slides. First is reflect. This is where we are scoping reconciliation. Committing to a reflect RAP allows your organization to spend time scoping and developing relationships with Indigenous peoples, companies, communities, and stakeholders, deciding on your vision for reconciliation and exploring your pillars of influence before committing to specific actions or initiatives. This process will help to produce future RAPs that are meaningful, mutually beneficial, and sustainable. Innovate. Commitments within this RAP allow your organization to be aspirational and innovative in order to organize or to help your organization to gain a deeper understanding of its pillars of influence and establish the best approach to advance reconciliation. An Innovate RAP focuses on developing and strengthening relationships with Indigenous peoples, engaging staff and stakeholders in reconciliation, developing and piloting innovative strategies to empower our Indigenous friends. Stretch. These are for companies that have established a strong approach towards advancing reconciliation internally and within the organization's pillars of influence. This type of RAP is focused on implementing longer-term strategies and working towards defined measurable goals and targets. The stretch RAP requires organizations to embed reconciliation into business strategies to become operating norm or business as usual. Elevate. These are for organizations that are ready to take on a leadership position to advance national reconciliation. Elevate RAP organizations have a strong strategic relationships and actively champion initiatives to empower and create societal change. Elevate RAP organizations also require greater transparency and accountability through their activities and they share their best practices with other organizations who are starting their reconciliation journeys. As many of you have heard, we have developed the inclusion continuum here at Indigenous Work. So we do have the 7-stage continuum: indifference, intimidation, image, initiation, incubation, integration, and finally full inclusion. Now I'm going to discuss how the 7-stage inclusion continuum aligns with the REP process. So the aligning the RAP phases with the inclusion continuum. So in stage 4, which we call initiation, that was where we are reflecting and scoping. Inclusion and reconciliation has just started. So that is where we find stage 4 of the inclusion continuum. Innovate is our stage 5, where we are implementing inclusion and reconciliation. So our incubation stage, where inclusion is nurtured as a core competency. Stage 6 is integration, and where we find stretch and embedding of reconciliation. Integration and inclusion as a catalyst for growth, as well as elevate, leadership. Stage 7 is where we maximize performance to achieve full conclusion. To wrap things up, the 10 promising practices. So 1, you want to understand the current Indigenous populations and your surrounding Indigenous populations for your organizations when considering how to develop your reconciliation action plan so it is accurate to your organization. And understanding the history of the Indigenous populations, why reconciliation action plans are needed. Again, the truths of the histories that have happened to the Indigenous populations within Canada, and consider utilizing UNDRIP as the framework for your reconciliation policies and procedures. Review the TRC's 94 calls to actions with paying specific attention to the corporate sector call to action number 92. Again, reconciliation is about the relationships, people, and building, restoring that trust amongst the populations, and giving appropriate time and resources to developing your reconciliation action plan. Commit to the RAP phases, understanding that it goes from stage 1 to stage 4, and there will be a timeline within each one of these phases. Typically, your entire RAP phases should take about 8 years to get to the elevate within your RAP plans. And understanding that your company's cultural capabilities plays an important role in developing these plans. And then finally, that it is important to communicate and celebrate the successes you find within your organizations. Thank you, miigwech, merci. With that, I would like to open the floor for any of you that happen to have questions.
Yeah, thank you, Mandy. That was a good presentation, and it's always great to see Senator Sinclair again, even in the video there, and his comment about it's important for us to remember. It's just so very true. A number of people have already written in saying, are we going to get the presentation? Please send it to us. We certainly will send that out following the presentation today, along with the PowerPoint. So you'll be able to distribute it within your organization. We certainly invite people from the audience here today to provide questions in the chat or comments, and we're happy to answer any questions that you might have today. There's one question there I see, Mandy. Are there any organizations you can point to that are already at the elevation stage or elevate stage? And are there good examples of leaders in reconciliation? So we'll put that open. Mandy, you might have some suggestions or some comments on who's been successful at this. And we also have Nicole Huska on the line, who's our director of for our Leadership Circle membership. And Nicole, you're welcome to come in as well with any of the commentary on the questions.
Yeah, so the entire process of reconciliation is new to Canada. When you think, of the dates, and keep in mind, that I mentioned the 8-year stages of reconciliation action plans. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action came out in 2015. So in terms of Canada, we are a little bit newer to this area. The RISE reconciliation framework was developed by Reconciliation Australia. So in Australia, they have a little bit more experience in the area. Within Canada, we are starting. There are a few organizations that I would say have started the process. And again, right now it's more about understanding your company's cultural capabilities and working with Indigenous relationships and organizations. 2017, I do believe, Craig, was when IW did the study, and then the common large message that came out of that was that 87% of small and medium businesses had not started their process of reconciliation, or they didn't know how to start or where to start. It wasn't a matter of that they didn't want to. It's finding the right stages. So many companies are disengaged in terms of reconciliation and inclusion.
Another question here from someone else. Looks like Charmaine Dean rather. Are there educational institutions who are further along the path that we can chat with about the journey? University of Calgary developed a strategy, and they spent a good year at it, and it's easily available on the internet, and you can certainly have a look at it. It's very thoughtful, and they've made a point of trying to understand how reconciliation is needed in different areas of the university, whether it's in areas of enrollment or in the pedagogy and curricula, the hiring practices, and so on. And so I think it's a good model that I would point to, just as an example.
I would just to add to that, Craig, 2019 study that was done, what they found there was 87% of colleges and universities, more specifically, the post-secondary organizations, have begun to utilize, thinking back to the 10 principles of reconciliation, elders, as the traditional knowledge keepers. 2019, 87% post-secondary organizations have started to engage the Indigenous knowledge keepers, on Indigenous methodologies in ways to incorporate, Western ways of education, as well as Indigenous knowledge value systems.
A good point. Another question: are there resources we can work with to join internal team calls to talk about land acknowledgements and the importance around reconciliation? So Nicole, maybe you could just introduce yourself and explain your role with Indigenous Works and your efforts to work individually with Leadership Circle members.
So I might be upside down. I cannot see my own.
No, you are right side up.
It's a good day then. Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Nicole Huska. I am the National Director for Member Relationships here at Indigenous Works, specifically for developing and maintaining relationships with our Leadership Circle members. I'm new to the position. I've been in it for about a month and a half, and my goal, and your organizations will be receiving emails from me over the next couple weeks, probably sooner, inviting you to a 30-minute kind of check-in just specific to your organization. And then I will be doing quarterly check-ins. It's not required, obviously, but it's optional just to kind of get a sense of where your organization is at, how we might be able to be of service, and to give everybody kind of a one-on-one update on what Indigenous Works is doing. As you might know about the organization, they've been working in this space for the last 20 years, and our CEO, Kelly, flies all over the country, attending things and taking meetings, and kind of has a really good finger on the pulse of everything that's going on in the Indigenous inclusion space. And then Craig here is our in-house policy guru, and he reads and writes so much in this space. And so there's a wealth of knowledge, and they've hired me on to just connect with our members and continue to kind of further the conversation that way. So with respect to land acknowledgements, we do have a service that we can offer. If you want to send me an email, you'll see Subash has put it, Nicole H at indigenousworks.ca in there, and I've also put it in. Any questions you have at all specific to something that your organization needs, let me know. I will send you an email back and find out what we can do for you. That which I do not know, I will ask the people who have been around in the organization for a long time and get back to you. So I hope that clears it up a bit. And really, even the smallest thing, or if you haven't received an email from me because I've kind of got to stagger the meetings and you want one now, send me an email. I'll fit you in. I have a Calendly. I'm really available to be of service to you and your organizations.
That's good. Thanks, Nicole. I just want to get through as many questions as we can. It says, great questions. I'd like to pose this from a tourism perspective as well. Are there any tourism associations or businesses that are best practices to look at or to look to? So I'll answer with two examples in a different way. I do think that Travel Alberta has been doing some work in this area, and I can't remember the details of the names, but I do recall that one good thing that they had done is situated or co-located their organization with an Indigenous tourism organization for the province. And just that proximity has produced a lot of good communication and dialogue and much better understanding. So I think that that's a good practice, and the sharing of office space with an Indigenous organization is bound to bring better understanding. We've worked a while in last year in the agriculture sector, and there's a growing number of Indigenous farms and groups like that that have done a lot of work on traditional knowledge, the understanding of traditional plant life and crops, and the meaning that different foods have for Indigenous organizations. And so this is an area of tourism that I think is going to grow a lot. And there's a lot of people that come to the countries that are looking for an Indigenous experience, and having tours of these farms and which incorporate not only sampling of food, but stories and kind of oral histories of plants and things. It's a really good way to bring reconciliation, to talk about how different groups view the land, their importance, cultural importance of the land, and things like that. So I really think that that's an area that could be looked at in terms of best practices and reconciliation.
And if I can just add to another example, Craig.
Sure.
Superior North Country, found in Northwestern Ontario, is a good example as well. When they were doing their economic diversification studies, one of the themes that came out of that for the area was that the cultural component and cultural experiences were missing from a tourism perspective. So they started working with the local Indigenous communities to provide those experiences. So again, thinking back, reconciliation, building those relationships. I would have a look at their websites and their offerings as well, if you're looking for some best practices and resources.
Yeah, good, thank you. Another question, thinking through employment and retention, what counsel do you have to businesses to create a safe, equitable, and inclusive workplace? Is there any teachings on the 7 generations with respect to leadership development? Mandy, why don't you start that, and then Nicole or myself will come in.
I'm rereading the question, Craig.
Sure, sorry. You want me to repeat it, or?
Well, so again, so 7 generations is one of the common teachings that we find within the Indigenous communities. Creating a safe, equitable, and inclusive workplace. Think about what I said about cultural capabilities and the roles within the organizations, and your roles as managers, to provide that safe, equitable, inclusive workplace is understanding your cultural competency, your cultural awareness, cultural safety, and cultural humility. And when you start there, you can further, disseminate that information in what we call, an enterprise-wide approach, where all sectors of your businesses are engaged in understanding, the cultural awareness of Indigenous groups here in Canada, to create targeted strategies and practices and best practices for Indigenous employees within the organization.
I think this is a very thoughtful question, and we could really answer it and talk about it all day. But I do find that when we first start talking with organizations, whether it's a company or an NGO or whatever, I'm often very interested in whether or not they have a good pulse on the Indigenous experience inside the workplace and what that looks like. And getting Indigenous people together, we often play this role actually at the beginning of strategies. And we do kind of sharing circles or focus groups with Indigenous people, just to better understand what their day-to-day experience is like, and what they think about the workplace and how they see improvements could be made, and whether they're seeing good resolve and efforts on the part of the organization to make positive changes. So I think that this kind of thing is really, really important. We often talk about the importance of cultural safety, the ability for Indigenous people to express their culture and have an Indigenous cultural identity within the organization. And what does that look like? So I think there's many aspects, many dimensions to this question that I think are very, very thoughtful and worth pursuing. It could probably be a webinar just on its own. So thank you for the question. Just sort of scratching the surface there. I'm just panning down to see if there's any other questions. It says, thank you, Mandy, for the presentation. As Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Advisor or Specialist, I see EDI institutional plans as an opportunity to open spaces for a reconciliation plan. How do you think reconciliation plans and EDI could be articulated to ensure sustainable results without losing the specificity of Indigenous people's needs and views? Well, that's an interesting question. Mandy, do you have some thoughts? I certainly do as well.
Yeah, I do. So again, it's considering the organization's operations. Are they a local business or are they a national business? One of the things that I've always said, in my presentations, is it cannot be a one size fits all. If you are a national organization, the cultural differences and practices will range and vary between the Indigenous groups. But if you are a local, smaller organization looking at that regional approach and understanding those practices and focusing on the Indigenous specificity, I always like to use the example of, where my traditional territory is. Yes, I'm Anishinaabe, I'm Ojibwe, but 6 hours down the road, some of the cultural practices vary with other Ojibwe groups in my territory. So it's focusing and understanding the indigenous populations of where your order of operations are, and taking that into consideration, because they are the practices can be so different.
Yeah, thank you, Mandy. So again, just looking at the question, a lot of organizations have adopted very comprehensive EDI programs and strategies. And, if you're an organization that's based in, say, Ontario or Toronto or other, there are many groups in the area. So I think there's something like 85 different minority groups in the Toronto area, just as an example. So I think it's important to be cognizant of the high importance that Indigenous people have within the broader context of EDI. And I think it's really important that companies and organizations do things that are particular to Indigenous representation and employment and other kinds of workplace accommodations. So I think that I say that because of the legislation and the fact that Indigenous people were here for many, many years. And so I just think that it's really, really important. And that's why we've adopted Indigenous National Indigenous Peoples Day and other things like that. But how it's manifest is very challenging, of course. We often look at different policy areas, for instance, and the policy that I like in particular on workplaces is from the Yukon government. So it's called a respectful workplace policy. And I encourage you to look at it because it does strike a balance between sort of general EDI type policy objectives, but there's also reference to the importance of Indigenous people, which is not surprising given the particular location in the High North. So I think there's ways of sort of striking a balance in the construction of your EDI strategies and policies and how they reflect, in particular, the importance of Indigenous peoples. Just panning questions again. And Nicole notes that if there are questions that have been posed in the chat that have not been answered, please email her. And she's given her email in the address on the side there in the chat.
There's a great one from Curtis, Craig.
Oh yes, let me read this. Okay, it says, "Thank you, Mandy. My organization
We're not doing that right now. We're not doing
a reconciliation journey. As part of that, we recognize that we do not have a significant presence of Indigenous people in our organization. We aim to change that, but how do we best gain Indigenous input or potentially co-design of our plans now? I do recognize that with Indigenous Works, we are gaining some of that input and very appreciative of that support. So you're trying to understand how to co-develop. So co-development is really, really important. It was interesting, a couple of years back, the Canadian Human Rights Commission did an audit of the banking and financial sector. And one of the things they noted was that not enough banks or businesses in that sector were asking their own Indigenous employees for input into the kinds of strategies that they've contemplated or are trying to develop. And I thought it was a great observation. And it was especially poignant because the banking and financial sector, as many of you know, falls within the employment equity legislation. And part of the reason they did this horizontal audit, as they called it, it's the first time they've done that, is that they were a bit frustrated with the fact that the representation figures had plateaued in that sector. So we've since gone on and we've partnered with the Canadian Human Rights Commission, and we're starting to do some more work in the banking and financial sector. We've started to interview Indigenous employees inside banks, and starting to better understand what their suggestions are for more relevant strategies and outreach to Indigenous communities and so on for purposes of employment. So we like the idea of co-development, and often the opportunity to do so is within the means of the organization with their employee resource group. It's often a very good role for them to help develop the strategy. Mandy, did you have some comments there as well?
Yeah, unfortunately, for many organizations, it is a perspective that many employers want, but are lacking. You've heard me reference in the phases of developing your RAP plans, the pillars of influence. So when I discuss the pillars of influence, there's 6 of them. Your reach, proximity, expertise, credibility, relevancy, and trust. So those are the pillars that you need to focus on when developing your plans. And the expertise and credibility is where that perspective comes into place. You want to consider, your perceived versus your actual expertise in the space. So that's where you'll want validation from credible sources to ensure that your thoughts, actions, and products that you are producing are indeed accurate.
Good, thanks, Mandy. As I'm scanning down, I see some people have written in about some further information about tourism and Travel Alberta and so on, and provided some specific websites and so on for people to visit. So thank you. Hello, my name is Sophie Pierre. Hello. And I'm with the St. Eugene Resort, a First Nations owned and operated business at a former residential school, and offer unique experiences based on Indigenous values for reconciliation. Welcome. Thank you for attending. Keith Willoughby. Hi, Keith. One valuable example I've seen, re-Indigenous engagement at universities, occurred this past year. An Indigenous instructor in our school requested students to develop personal land acknowledgements. It was impactful. It highlighted the relationship building that is a key part of reconciliation. That's a very good comment. Mandy, did you have you had some comments on land acknowledgement. Did you want to say anything more on?
Yeah, so when we consider the 94 specific calls to action that the TRC developed, bringing forth the process of land acknowledgements and making that an operating practice within your organization is one of the recommendations that the commission did come out with. It's a deliberate and respectful act towards reconciliation amongst your Indigenous friends and populations here in Canada.
That's great. Well, that was pretty good. I was really happy with the questions that we got today, and there were certainly some very thoughtful observations and questions. So thank you all for participating in that. And Mandy, thank you very much. I think it was just great information. And
yeah, my email's on the slide up on your screen right now. If you have any further questions, feel free to email myself as well. Reconciliation is an area that we've been doing extensive work in.
Yeah, it sure has. And Nicole, thank you very much as well for attending, and thanks to our team for helping to put this on today. So for the rest of you, I hope you enjoy your long weekend. I've been speaking to you from Mi'kma'ki, the traditional and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, and I too am looking forward to our long weekend ahead of us here. So thank you very much for attending.